Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well today. Earlier this year we had the 80th anniversary theatrical release of one of my favorite films of all time, Warner Brothers' classic Casablanca. I was excited to see this, but then I only later realized that it's not actually the 80th anniversary yet, or at least it wasn't when they were celebrating it.
Have you taken leave of your senses?
I have. Sit down over there.
Casablanca was indeed premiered in 1942, and it was released to wider audiences on January 23rd. However, those dates are not actually connected. The movie was premiered on November 26th of 1942 in order to take advantage of the Allied invasion of North Africa, which included a naval battle at Casablanca. Meanwhile, the wider release was on January 23rd, 1943, which is why if you look back on the history of the Academy Awards, Casablanca wins Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay not in 1943, but in 1944. So yeah, when they were putting this together, somebody messed up the dates.
Sam,
Yes, boss.
it's December 1941 in Casablanca. What time is it in New York?
What? My watch stopped.
Though I guess if I'm being fair, they did give me the impetus for trying to make this video by falsely advertising what anniversary we're on, so we'll take what we can get, right? And what we get is what one of the screenwriters themselves said was a script full of more corn than Iowa and Kansas combined. But when corn works, it works. And it really does come down to how the characters work off of each other in this movie, because it's not the greatest script in the world, it's not the greatest effects in the world, but it has 6 of the greatest lines in cinematic history, according to the American Film Institute.
Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine. We'll always have Paris.
Round up the usual suspects.
Play it, Sam. Play as time goes by.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Here's looking at you, kid.
And then when the National Film Registry was created in 1989, Casablanca was one of the first 25 films that they inducted in for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. So at this point I could go off in several directions about what I love about this movie, but I'm just going to focus on a single scene, and if you've seen the title of this video, it's the Duel of the Anthems scene. But specifically, I want to stop right before we get to it and talk about the actors in the movie, because, as I said earlier, with them being the impetus for the characters making the film so good, the backstory for a lot of the actors that appeared in credited and uncredited roles is quite fascinating looking at this movie. So let's quickly set the scene. We have a group of German officers who are singing a German anthem, while the rest of the cafe looks on uneasy at the reminder of Nazis being in what's supposed to be unoccupied French North Africa. Everyone it is except for Paul Henreid, who is furious at the sight and goes across the cafe to where the musicians are and tells them to
Play La Marseillaise. Play it.
They hesitate until Humphrey Bogart gives them the go-ahead, and we pause. You can probably guess where this is going, but first, let's look at the actors that are actually in the movie. First, I want to note that only 3 of the credited actors were born in the United States. They being Bogart, who's playing our male lead, Dooley Wilson, whose piano has currently been appropriated by the Nazis for this scene, and Joy Page, who's playing a Bulgarian refugee, but in real life is actually studio head Jack Warner's stepdaughter. We also have a pair of my favorite British actors from the period in Claude Rains and Sidney Greenstreet. Then we come to Ingrid Bergman, and it's through her that we start to see the connections to real history that I'm wanting to explore. An acclaimed actress from Sweden, Bergman signed a contract in the late 1930s to star in the German film industry. She only made one of the planned pictures, however, as she realized that in order to get anywhere in the German film industry, you had to belong to the Nazi Party and no one else. Later she would express guilt because she actually didn't understand what the Nazis were doing, only that she didn't want to belong to the party in order to make movies. Other members of the cast already knew all too well what the Nazis would be capable of. Take Peter Lorre, for instance, who was a breakout star in Germany for his role in the film M, and has one of the more iconic voices in the period.
You know, Rick, watching you just now with the Deutsche Bank, one would think you've been doing this all your life.
Now, what makes you think I haven't?
Oh, nothing.
Soon after that role in M, though, he had to flee the Nazi regime due to being of Jewish heritage. And he's not alone in Casablanca's cast for being a Jewish refugee. Earlier in the casino, the actress who asked S.C. Sekal's character if Bogart will drink with them was also a Jewish refugee named Trude Berliner, who fled to France after the Nazis seized power. Later in the film, we see fellow Jews Ilka Grüning and Ludwig Stossel playing the couple who are drinking with Sekal in broken English before they leave for America. Grüning, like Berliner, also made her way to France following the Nazis' rise, while Stossel chose to go home to Austria, and he was there when it was annexed in 1938. Because of this, he ended up being imprisoned in a camp several times before he managed to escape to Paris and then on to London. Then there is Kurt Boas, who would have an acting career spanning over 80 years and was another Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. He plays a pickpocket several times in the film, and he also has a run-in with S.C. Sekal. And since I've mentioned Sekal several times, he too was a Jewish refugee from Germany. Similar to Stossel, he went home to his native country, his being Hungary, and his family was still there in 1940 when Hungary joined the war on the side of the Nazis. Sekal was able to flee to America, but many of his family were caught, and several of them died in the concentration camps, including his 3 sisters and a niece. Another war refugee was Marcel Dalio, a popular French actor who had to flee during the fall of France. In fact, he was popular enough that the Nazis actually used his face on propaganda posters for a typical Jew. He and his wife fled to Lisbon in Portugal, where they would obtain Chilean passports and sail from there to Mexico. However, they and several hundred others were stranded when it was discovered that their passports were actually faked. The two would be able to obtain temporary Canadian passports and use those to make their way into the United States. For those who have seen Casablanca, this may sound a bit familiar. The film begins with saying that refugees from the fall of France are trying to get to Lisbon, though the refugee trail shown in the movie is not the route taken by Dalio and his wife. In fact, both the A and B plots of the film revolve around refugees trying to reach America, and the key items in the plot are a pair of exit visas that can get our characters to Lisbon, and from there on to the New World in America. And since I've mentioned her, Dalio's wife Madeleine LeBeau also appears in the film, and in fact has a prominent close-up in the coming scene. She was born near Paris and would go on to be the last member of the cast alive, passing away in 2016. She herself was not Jewish, but she nonetheless fled with Dalio when the Nazis invaded. Making it to America, however, did not signal the end of her troubles. While she was filming her scenes with a German officer played by Hans Heinrich von Twardowski, Dalio would file for divorce on the grounds of desertion. Von Twardowski was also a refugee from Germany, though he didn't flee because he was Jewish. He was actually a homosexual, and the Nazis put homosexuals in concentration camps as well as the Jews. It is well to remember that along with the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, there were also millions of Russians, Poles, Roma, Serbs, people with disabilities, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and political opponents that died as well. Von Twardowski and many like him fled from this persecution, and he is also not the only one wearing a Nazi uniform in this movie that is a refugee as well. Take, for instance, Richard Rhine, who was an Austrian who either had to flee the Nazis because of his Jewish ancestry or because the Nazis actually expelled him from the country.
The reason is a little vague.
Thanks, Conrad. And speaking of Conrad Veidt, he was one of Germany's most prominent actors before the Nazis seized power. When Goebbels put out a race questionnaire to see what everyone in the industry was, he answered that he was Jewish. He in fact wasn't, but he had just married his Jewish wife and refused to leave her, instead sharing the plight of her people. He would emigrate to England, where he would remain fervently anti-Nazi, and he would even donate part of his fortune to the British war effort on several occasions. He also demanded that any Nazi officer he played had to be a villain. Another avowed anti-Nazi was Helmut Dantin, a Viennese activist who opposed the Nazis when the union with Austria was confirmed. He wasn't able to flee, and like Stossel was put in a concentration camp, his being outside Vienna. He was fortunate to only spend a few months in the camp, as his father was able to secure his release due to his influence in Vienna, and Helmut was immediately sent to California to live with some family friends. Then we circle back to Paul Henreid, who is about to lead the coming scene. He was such an avowed anti-Nazi in Austria that he was actually labeled an official enemy of the Third Reich. He fled to Britain before the Nazis could get him, But when war broke out, the British actually contemplated either interning or deporting him because he was not well known among them and he was a foreign national of an enemy power. Fortunately for Henried, Conrad Veidt knew him and spoke on his behalf, saving him from either option. For those who've seen the movie, this is an interesting dynamic. Veidt's character is trying to put Henried back in a concentration camp, but in real life, Veidt acted to protect Henried from such a fate. I would also like to highlight the choice of songs really quick. I said before that the Germans are singing a German anthem. That's because this song isn't actually Horst Wessel Lied, the Nazis' anthem that also served as Germany's co-anthem from 1935 until the end of World War II, when the song became banned in Germany and Austria. Horst Wessel Lied was under copyright, and thus there was no legal distribution of the song to countries that were not aligned with Germany. Warner Brothers wouldn't have had a problem with this if they were just going to Allied countries, but since the movie was going to be sent to neutral countries, this would have meant that having the song in there would mean they would have to pay the German Nazis royalties. So instead, the actors are singing The Watch on the Rhine. The song was first penned in 1840 and calls on the Germanic people to oppose the French during the Rhine crisis of 1840. When France was attempting to restore its control over the provinces of the left bank of the Rhine that it had conquered in 1795, but it had been forced to return those to German control following the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Needless to say, the Germans on the left bank did not approve of being controlled by the French again, to the point that there is even a line in the song that says, "And if my heart breaks in death, you won't become a Frenchman yet." And speaking of 1795, this was the year that the French Republic adopted Le Marseillaise as the national anthem of France. However, this title is actually a nickname that the song received after being sung by volunteers coming to Paris from Marseille to oppose the incursions of the First Coalition, notably the Austrian and Prussian forces coming across the Rhine River. The song was originally written in 1792 under the name War Song of the Army of the Rhine, as a rallying cry due to the poor performance of the French army in the early battles of that particular war. So not only are the two songs sung by opposing forces, but the songs themselves are opposed to one another, both calling to defend the land from invaders across the Rhine. Now with all of this in mind, let's go back to the scene, with those playing the Nazis jovial at their success, and the free people of the world watching them from across the room. A room full of those who were actually forced to flee home because of the Nazis in real life, some as recently as 2 years ago, and some whose family will die in the concentration camps back home. It is a room full of people who fled because of their religion, their ethnicity, their sexuality, and their opposition to the party. A room full of some who actually escaped the camps themselves. A room full of those who denounced that evil regime and helped fund the war against it. And some who were even considered the Reich's official enemies. And for this one moment, on this tiny set in Hollywood, this band of refugees gets to strike back at those who took so much from them. Unfortunately, Warner Brothers keeps copywriting this particular segment of the videos, so I'm just going to have the 1812 Overture's use of La Marseillaise playing while I narrate the scene. Interesting before we start, the 1812 Overture was written in 1880, exactly 1 year after La Marseillaise was reinstated as the French national anthem. It had been discontinued as such in 1805 by Napoleon, of all people. So, Laszlo starts singing with the musicians, and the rest of the cafe joins him. Strasser tries to get the Germans to sing louder, but the strength of the cafe is just too much for them to overcome, and they are forced to give in, with some of them even taking part in singing La Marseillaise. At this point, the refugees have won, but they're not going to give up the song just yet. The Nazis have taken far too much from them to not see their victory through to completion. Madeleine LeBeau gets her close-up that I mentioned earlier, then Laszlo leads us right into the crescendo of the song, which is the part that gets copyright claimed the most when I was trying to upload this. And then we get the finale, everyone starts cheering. And Strasser gets angry. Casablanca really is one of my favorite films of all time, and it's scenes like this, and the stories of the actors that were working on the film, that make me come back to it again and again. I cannot recommend this film enough, and I encourage that you go see it. And thank you for making it this far in the video. I hope that I haven't bored you too much and you tune into the next one. But even so, take care of yourselves, and God bless.